There's a line in the water where the ships all pass, where the world holds its breath, where the shadows amass, and a voice in the dark says, we'll take control. But history's whisper says we've paid that toll. We've seen this road, we know that sound. A single spark can burn it down. Did he just light a fuse tonight? Strike a match in the fading light, saying it's small, saying it's fine. But we've heard those words before in time. Did he just light a fuse tonight? There were men once before who believed the same, that they'd play with the fire but avoid the flame. But the gears all turned and the lines were drawn, and the world woke up to a war at dawn. They thought they'd win, they thought they knew, but the fire spread like it always do. Did he just light a fuse tonight? Strike a match in the fading light, calling it strength, calling it right, while the edges blur between wrong and right. Did he just light a fuse tonight? You can't outrun what you ignite. You can't command the growing night, and every step you justify brings something closer we can't deny. Did he just light a fuse tonight? Hold it close like it's his right, but the flame don't care who struck the spark. It only knows how to burn the dark. Did he just light a fuse tonight?
From Tom Hartman's Daily Take Substack. Did Trump just light a fuse he can't control? The Strait of Hormuz crisis could be following the same path that led to World War I. Published April 13th, 2026. Saturday's back-to-back headlines on the Washington Post were, quote, "They have chosen not to accept our terms," end quote, Vance says. And, quote, U.S. intelligence shows China taking a more active role in Iran war, end quote. They echo headlines from a century ago that reported on the early days what quickly became World War I. In 2021, China and Iran became military allies, signing a, quote, broad strategic partnership encompassing economic, diplomatic, and security dimensions, end quote. Russia signed a similar comprehensive military security agreement with Iran in January of last year. The three countries are now military allies and formally assisting each other. Hold that thought. Then, yesterday morning, America's resident madman, Donald Trump, announced on his Nazi-infested social media site that the United States Navy will illegally blockade the Strait of Hormuz, the narrow checkpoint through which 20% of the world's oil used to flow every day, threatening to intercept, quote, every vessel in international waters, end quote, that's paid a toll to Iran. The U.S. blockade of the strait begins the hour that I published this article, 10 a.m. Eastern Time on Monday, April 13th. That means all the shipping of oil for China and drones for Russia will be intercepted by the U.S. We're now blocking the war and energy supplies of nations that have nuclear weapons and whose military assets are already in the region. And it came just after the peace talks in Islamabad, led by 3 American grifters with absolutely no diplomatic experience, had predictably collapsed. What happens next will depend entirely on whether anybody in this administration has ever seriously studied what happened the last time a similar cascade of great-powered commitments, cornered leaders, and military miscalculations all converged at once. 112 years ago this summer, a young Bosnian Serb named Gavrilo Princip fired 2 shots in Sarajevo, killing Archduke Franz Ferdinand of Austria-Hungary. What followed was a deadly catastrophe because every major European power had spent the previous 40 years putting together mutual defense treaties for other major European powers. In the 1908 Bosnian crisis, Austria-Hungary had annexed Bosnia, land that Serbia claimed. The Serbs were humiliated and furious. The Balkan Wars of 1912 and 13 left Serbia stronger and much more willing to reach out to the Slavic people still living in Austria-Hungarian rule, particularly those in Bosnia, further enraging the Austrian-Hungarians. Everybody was armed to the teeth and frankly paranoid about everybody else. So when Franz Ferdinand's assassination gave Austria-Hungary an excuse to punish its longtime enemy Serbia, those treaties clicked into place like the tumblers of a massive lock combination, and the doors of hell swung open into the most catastrophic war the world had at that time ever seen. Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia. Russia, bound by pan-Slavic solidarity and treaty, mobilized. Germany, allied with Austria-Hungary and seeking the Russian mobilization, declared war on Russia. The Franco-Russian alliance dragged France in. Once the fighting started, Germany's Schiffland Plan required invading France through neutral Belgium, which triggered Britain's 1839 treaty obligation to protect Belgian neutrality. Within 6 weeks of 2 pistol shots in Sarajevo, virtually every major power in Europe was engaged in a brutal war that escalated within the inevitability and power of a landslide. The leaders who set the whole machine in motion genuinely believed they could control the escalation, but they were terribly and tragically wrong. The interlocking agreements and past hostilities simply took over, and 17 million people died. I've been thinking about Sarajevo a lot this week because what's happening in the Strait of Hormuz right now follows the same terrifying script, except that this time the European, Middle Eastern, and Asian powers that are being pulled toward what could easily become World War III all have nuclear weapons. But here's how we got here. Benjamin Netanyahu made 6 trips to the White House in the year before the war began, each time pressing Trump and his old family friend Jared Kushner with the argument that Iran was ripe for regime change and that the mullahs were one good strike away from falling, and that history was calling. And what the New York Times reporting now makes clear, and what Trump's own CIA director and Secretary of State reportedly called farcical and, quote, bullshit, end quote, in private, is that Netanyahu had an overwhelming personal reason to want this war. He's been fighting a fraud, bribery, and breach of trust criminal trial that could put him in prison if he's convicted. Wars are good for embattled leaders. They can generate emergency status and even pause court proceedings. When this war started on February 28th, Netanyahu's trial did indeed grind to a halt under Israel's wartime court emergency rules, which had to be repeatedly extended. The trial is only now, this week, resuming. Trump, to help his fellow authoritarian, has been pressuring publicly Israel's president to pardon Netanyahu, telling him to do it, quote, today, end quote, and calling him a, quote, disgrace for hesitating. So Trump, himself facing a crisis from the Epstein documents and accusations of raping a 13-year-old girl, and, quote, Whiskey Pete, end quote, Hegseth, who simply loves war, launched a bloody confrontation in which one of the key decision-makers' primary motivation, at least on the Israeli side, was to keep himself out of prison. And 44 days later, the man who should be in the defendant's chair is instead flying into southern Lebanon to pose with troops, his popularity now sky high in Israel because of the war, while the United States Navy blockades one of the most consequential waterways on the planet. Yesterday, Trump posted to his failing social media site a declaration that may end upon seeing, in retrospect, much like the assassination of Archduke Ferdinand. He proclaimed that the Navy will begin, quote, blockading any and all ships trying to enter or leave the Strait of Hormuz, end quote, and will, quote, seek and interdict every vessel in international waters that has paid a toll to Iran, end quote. That last sentence is the one that could rock the planet because, as the independent National Security Desk analysis makes clear, Trump's phrase, quote, every vessel in international waters, end quote, is a global directive. It means the U.S. Navy now officially claims the legal right to board, search, and seize foreign ships anywhere in the world's oceans, as well as the ships of any nation trying to pass through the strait. Under international maritime law, that's called piracy. And here's the other parallel to the tensions between Austria-Hungary and Serbia back in the day. Roughly 80% of China's oil imports that transit the strait that Trump just said he will, quote, blockade, end quote, are Chinese-owned or Chinese-connected vessels. China already has a Type 055 cruiser, a Type 052 destroyer, and a massive surveillance ship sitting right there in the region, in the Gulf of Oman. Chinese satellites have been providing real-time targeting intelligence to Iran throughout this war. Russia has been running electronic warfare systems that, according to pre-war assessments, degrade American radar and communications by as much as 80%. Iran's military has been successful in killing over a dozen American troops and wounding hundreds, and downing multiple U.S. military aircraft because of targeting information Putin's reportedly been giving them. These are active military contributions to the Iranian war effort right now. So what happens when a U.S. destroyer orders a Chinese-flagged tanker to heave to in this Strait of Hormuz and a Chinese warship sails between them? Trump has to choose between backing down and watching the blockade collapse or firing on the naval vessel of a country with roughly 400 nuclear warheads. And this isn't a purely hypothetical scenario. China and its leader, Xi Jinping, have made it abundantly clear that maintaining an uninterrupted energy supply through the strait is one of its core national interests. It won't simply steam away. On the Russian side, Vladimir Putin is also not a man who responds with moderation when being cornered. And he's already in deep trouble in his own country, as well as on his back foot in Ukraine. The Atlantic Council and RAND both have documented that Putin's domestic position is more stressed than at any point since his brutal and criminal Ukraine invasion began. Russia today faces runaway military spending, consuming 8% of the GDP, skyrocketing inflation, fuel shortages, and a society that polls show has grown deeply tired of the war in Ukraine. Analysts from the Royal United Services have concluded that Putin literally cannot afford to be seen accepting strategic defeat, because the entire justification of his authoritarian model rests on his promise to, quote, restore Russian greatness, end quote, make Russia great again. If he fails, he may not survive, not just politically, but physically. Russia has a long, ancient history of dealing harshly with its failed leaders. Thus, a cornered, domestically vulnerable Putin with 6,000 nuclear weapons, who is already actively helping Iran kill Americans, isn't a guy who backs down gracefully. He's a leader who escalates. And to compound things, yesterday one of the most important parts of the worldwide autocratic network Putin's been building for decades, including his support for Trump's election and re-election, collapsed. In Hungary, where Viktor Orban has spent 16 years building the model of, quote, illiberal democracy, end quote, that Trump, Vance, and Heritage Foundation have openly cited as their template, voters turned out in the highest numbers since the fall of communism, a stunning 78%, and handed a decisive victory to opposition leader Peter Magyar and his Tisza party. Vice President Vance was there just last week, rallying with Orban, promising Trump's, quote, economic might, end quote, to help out Hungary, which is suffering under years of corruption and looting by Orban's oligarch buddies. If it is held on. Today, that ally is soon to be gone. Magyar takes over in May. The worldwide autocratic network, which is now largely led by Putin, Trump, Orban, and Netanyahu, is beginning to fracture at its European edge. When great powers are simultaneously cornered with a smaller ally, when their leaders face domestic crises that demand the appearance of strength, when interlocking military commitments are already active in drawing them toward conflict, that's when the world has historically stumbled into catastrophes that nobody wanted and nobody planned. In 1914, it took 6 weeks until the dogs of all-out war fully unleashed. This time, we're already 43 days in, and we have destroyers parked in a mind strait that China needs to stay alive economically, and Russia would love to see humiliate the United States and Europe. Louise and I have traveled the world extensively. I've stood in the World War I cemeteries of France and Belgium with row after row of white crosses stretching to the horizon, and been stunned by the fact of every one of those young men died in a war that people who started it generally believed that they could control. The lesson of World War I is that leaders who think they can manage escalation usually can't. The time to speak up is right now, before the tumblers click into place. Call your senators and representative. You can reach them at the Capitol switchboard at 202-224-3121 and tell them to support the Democrats' war powers resolution that could stop Trump from going even farther down this treacherous, deadly, possibly planet-destroying road. Congress must reassert its constitutional war-making authority. Under our Constitution, no president gets to blockade an international waterway with a social media post. And the American people didn't vote for a nuclear confrontation with China and Russia over Benjamin Netanyahu's corruption trial. Trump must be impeached now. And make sure you're registered to vote, and that everyone you know is registered, because the November 2026 midterms are the most directive democratic check we still have on where this is all heading. Check your registration at vote.org.